Because they're afraid of people knowing what's going on in the government.
I understand the change.
I know that, but they're that's the plan, and you know.
That's one, the bridge, the road by the bridge, or the other road?
The other road, the one closest to Here's
the public notice.
They're probably one of mine then.
Yeah.
So how was your trip?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So where'd you go to?
Redford.
Oh, okay, right. Was that about 9 hours?
Probably close to 10. Close to 10. It was 1,125 miles out and back.
Hey, Leroy, how are you?
Oh, wow. What? No.
No?
This must have
Been
been
just
just
Huh? Oh, you went up there, huh?
Planning commission, huh? See you.
Yep.
Right?
I looked around up there and I think, what the hell are we doing raising cows down here?
Hey, just so you know, they don't send them out anymore.
I know, she wants to tell.
I didn't find out about maybe they only close them on the apparently information empowers.
Somebody needs to.
Well, it doesn't matter now because they're not sending
We
them.
had this.
So,
They're temporary. I think you can talk to them.
I never had that thing. We used to spend it for 3
Nice.
years. Colorado. And it got forced out.
remember Bruce's MO was like,
All
oh,
around
send
the
them out
country.
the last
Yeah.
possible.
So he says they got 2 sections of land.
That means they have to know what they're doing.
In the summer.
And they don't.
He says he runs twice a month for cows.
A week to 10 days.
Oh, I can't keep up with it. You know, they can't keep up with it. So
Feed.
yeah.
Well, that's what I say. I left Brigham City.
Yeah, okay.
And
You're gonna figure it out.
just mean.
It's just like we've been like,
The hay was only this tall. You know, to where I cutting really on the ground.
Right. Just because of
Just oh, but it's pretty. Not there many trees and stuff of that like.
yeah.
But it sure was pretty. A lot of black rock through there.
where are you going right?
We went up through Pocatello.
That's soon. I mean,
So I have a schedule for both of
we remember. That's when we have
Yeah.
them. I have like a whole schedule. Dina, that'll turn off as soon as the bodies get in here. Huh? That'll turn off as soon as the bodies get
What,
in
you
here.
need smoke?
No, it's flat.
Oh.
I want to sit here, but I'm at
What's that?
Joshua isn't here yet. Oh, I walked right now. I need to ask for it. No.
That's polarization.
Yeah, this is great.
Do you want to do it with the maps?
Let's see what we got.
Yeah, looking at the.
Is there enough with our 2 vehicles? How are you? Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I know that's so well, so the way we have it set up is that's so they're really focusing on you. So the chairman of the planning commission folks that are in here to take a look. As far as I know.
Leroy, he's on the, you're on the camera, correct? So he's in our Cedar City office.
The gentleman family. Yeah. So I get enough exploration for this to figure out where that was?
Yeah, I think that's kind of what it said.
Okay, all right.
That's what it said.
Yeah, that's how we interpreted the map. That's interesting. Hi, boss. This is the man who brought me
And you promised me 15 minutes of glory. I only had 2 seconds.
and they're passing the motion to get us some money.
All I did was introduce myself, and I didn't even get him to come to introduce me.
Before we go,
Interrupted me.
Well, there you go. Look at all of it. Look at all of it.
I think the other people are completely going
Yeah, just
a couple that were just
yeah, and it happens sometimes. That's awesome. That's great.
So I was, and you know, when they're looking at $10 million and $3 million,
Yeah, that's all right.
I don't want to give him a big head, but it was probably why he wrote that.
Yeah, that was a joint effort by a number of people, including me.
Yeah, we
But I think some of the smoothing we did in the small amount of money was good.
Yeah,
We did a little of that right at the beginning of the meeting, but we did some of that later. I think they were all planned out. And that was good.
And you're putting that 50%.
Yeah, exactly. And that is
I
part
didn't mean
of
to
it.
kick you out. I wasn't
Oh no, I'll sit right there.
So you're over here?
Yeah.
You got me in the middle.
Yeah. Big time.
Okay.
I think they do that on purpose to keep you in line.
And it's all they can do. It's a full-time job for everyone. Good, that was-
It is,
Well,
my
let me
goodness.
see what I've got.
We were nervous you were going to be having the round of your life up there. You're going to have trouble getting out of it.
Oh my God.
Caddyshack style.
It's a beautiful place.
Where were you playing?
Hobble Creek in Spanish in Springville, I think.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Up in the canyon.
The canyon, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Oh, just a gorgeous, really.
Is that the
fun
one that has
place.
the stream that kind of runs down?
Yes.
So my brother, he used to live right there in the mountains.
Really?
And he'd go up and walk the
Pretty.
creek.
Yeah.
Find a bunch of golf balls. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really cool place. Yeah.
So Josh, you need to scribe as well. We're all going to scribe so we get
Everybody's scribing. That's the plan.
Okay.
I couldn't find my original file for the general plan just now. It's probably in the car, but you.
So what do you need, the original?
Well, because I wanted, yeah. Do you have a copy of the?
It's a little bit half.
Oh, that's fine. I don't need it. We just as a rep.
Yes, here it is.
Oh yeah, sure. Everybody sit over there. Is that seriously how we're gonna play this?
Rod, do you need a copy of ours?
I'm going to move down. I'm going to go sit over there.
No kidding. Go sit over
Move
there.
down a little bit.
We're gonna do something.
Okay, this
Sorry.
is the one I need to sign.
Okay. 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 So I'll just reintroduce. I'll just go ahead. Reintroduce everybody. I'll ask the mayor. Well, actually, yeah.
You're in charge.
The agenda says Matt's in charge.
We changed it from computer, right? It's actually up to them. We'll talk. I would prefer that they not, that we stay with the people at the table. But we can have that discussion. We're fine.
Well, what do you want?
Just in terms of general discussion, I would generally like to let this be the group. But if you want to open it beyond that, I mean, it's your call. I would prefer that we don't do that. Unless there's something really compelling. Okay, notes. Yeah.
How are you doing physically?
Not the best.
Getting better.
I made dinner last night. I woke up with my hands.
Oh,
Well, that's great.
He's having, MWR Architects
Okay.
out of St. George.
Yeah.
That's the group he,
I think they're in old Ancestor Square area.
I think so. So that's what he said he was going to get a hold of them on.
That's awesome.
So, yeah.
So that'd be great.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Finally, right?
No kidding.
Little
Get some things going.
Yeah.
All right, well, then let's get started. Rob, thank you guys for coming. Hopefully we can have some discussion tonight.
That's the plan, huh?
But my knowledge is this, is I think we've had lots of public comments, open houses. I think this is generally for us to discuss this, and there'll be more in the future for the
Yes.
citizens to talk about. So let's just try to keep it here and get through this.
Yeah.
So,
I'm on, huh? Well, thank you. The first thing I want to say is thanks to all of you for coming. I know this is extra duty. I promised, I think everybody that we wrote that we'd stop at 9:30. We won't be done. You're never really done with this kind of an effort. It's a living, breathing, moving instrument. And so we're not going to be done at 9:30. No worries. It's okay. We're going to stop at 9:30 and we won't be done. And we'll keep at it. Lots of things to discuss. For the Planning Commission, we do intend to issue to each of you the element that you have liaison for this evening. I'm looking, making sure we got the copies and stuff. Otherwise, we'll send them to your tablets. We assigned liaisons a while back, and you've been tracking those particular elements for the meetings we've had so far. Now, it's your time to actually receive some of the written thoughts that we have, which are really the feedback from the open houses and the work that we've done in terms of outreach around the community, and help us determine if we heard things correctly, if we've got the most important things listed in the right manner, and those kinds of things. And from a statutory perspective, the Planning Commission is in charge of this process. So this is really one of the first steps where you are really going to take that command role and tell us your thoughts related to what we've come back with from all of the discussions we've had so far. So, right behind me, I don't know if you can all see this unless we move. We just wanted to sort of portray visually sort of how we view this kind of a process. So you're taking in all of this data, and so there's this big, large amount of stuff coming in and comments coming from wherever, and we did not prioritize any of that kind of stuff. We didn't give the mayor and some of the comments he gave us a higher priority than John Filano down the street or whatever in terms of that part of the discussion. Everything that was said to us from our perspective had equal weight. Okay, and so that's kind of this area where we're just absorbing everything that's coming in, not necessarily worrying about who's who or what's going on that way. And it's sort of this mind thing that's there's just tons of data. And the challenge in that place is just getting your arms around all of the input that's coming at you. And so what happens is you go through sort of a process where we're sort of trying to figure out what the priorities are and really narrowing it down to what we understand are the town's really most important priorities from a general planning perspective. So that's sort of what this is depicting. And so in this little area right here is where we really start writing some of the things that you're going to begin seeing for the first time tonight in terms of just what the general plan will actually begin to look like. So from my perspective, we're sitting at about this spot tonight. This is sort of a place where now we're sitting down with the leadership of the town, the planning commission, and the city council and town council. Once again, thank you. I know this is extra duty. And so we're sitting right here, and we're going to now receive some additional input that has a different weight to it from our perspective. It's the leadership group of the town, and so we're going to do a little bit of an expansion again in terms of how we talk about some of the issues that we're going to discuss tonight, and really begin in sort of that level, identifying in terms of a final report what this thing is going to look like, and to some degree setting the schedule and the expectations for the rest of the process. Any questions, comments, swear words related to that? Okay, good. All right, back at it. So I think initially I just wanted to introduce a few of the topics. We're going to go through each of the elements and some of the priorities and goal initiatives that we've identified that really constitute the general plan by element. But I wanted to read this to you. I just got sort of really kind of in this thing a number of days ago, and this happens a number of times because you're working on this pretty intently for a significant period of time. But I just wrote this little piece, and I don't know that it means anything to anybody except me. But I think it's a decent introduction to what we're doing. So I wrote, if everyone in the whole world had to be on the Virgin Town General Plan Committee, the town would have an enormous problem. Everyone would want to live here. There's truly a welcoming feel and an atmosphere to find peace in this community. The world-class scenery all around only enhances the cultural setting. Virgin Town, and especially its people, have a lot going for them. Small wonder that a lot of people are passionate about their town and their vision for her future. That's just how I feel about it. As I've experienced a whole bunch of conversation throughout town, a lot of input from a whole bunch of people. There's a diversity of thought. There's not a consensus necessarily on a number of issues, but there's civility that I've experienced, and a sense that I just related. And I think, to me, that's part of what we want to preserve as a community, and it has to do more with the attitudes and views of the citizens, as opposed to a building here and a building there and that kind of stuff. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And I compliment you on it because we have seen that. Would you like to add anything to that, since you've done a lot of the writing, or on the infrastructure part? And I'll explain kind of how this will play as well.
I just want to say, first of all, thank you to everyone. This is so far has been just a great experience. It's been, fun hearing the positives and the negatives, and the positives may think the negative sides aren't negative, and the negatives may think the positives aren't positive. So we've had, like Rod said, so much information coming in through emails, through discussions, through the open houses. But I mean, in the end, I know that everyone has the same vision again for the town, and to keep it what it is, but to still move forward so it can grow and accommodate, you know, all your new families coming in, as well as to preserve those that do live here. And I've heard some, I think a majority of the stuff though has been very positive. I want to say that. You know, there's been a few negatives, but most of it is very positive, and it all makes sense too. And so that I've been happy to hear. You know, knowing that there's 2, 3, 4 different sides in this town, it's good to see that everyone is positive in the end. So.
Yeah, you know, the interesting part for me is, you know, I haven't been to all the meetings, but from what I get, the feedback I get, and it's all been really great. The cool thing about working on this general plan is it's made me take a step back and kind of had an opportunity to put myself, you know, in maybe, you know, reading the comments and seeing the interest everybody has in the town. It makes me have an idea of the town. A community is like a living, breathing organism, right? You know, and you have to take care of it. You have to manage it. You have to make sure that it's growing, and everybody, you know, I think you guys do a really good job. Like, and you know, the community in general does that, and you can see that a lot of people are passionate about that. You know, on our end, it makes me feel passionate about it as well. You know, it makes me want to do a better job when I see people involved, and so it's been a great experience so far.
Cool, thank you. So, Cameron, I'd like you to take a minute and talk about the vision that the Planning and Zoning Commission has for the sort of the framework for this piece.
The vision statement?
Yeah, do you want me to?
Yeah. The vision statement we talked about making goes like this. We will create a community that promotes a safe, comfortable neighborly environment that adds to the beauty of the scenic surroundings by encouraging principles of abundance and collaboration for all citizens, fostering a community of economic growth and stability for families to live in and enjoy, providing opportunities for others from around the world to also enjoy the rural atmosphere and beauty of the area. That's kind of what we...
So, do any of you on the Planning Commission want to comment about that process, or how you feel about that statement?
Sean kind of took the lead on writing that, though we all discussed it quite a bit in 2 of our meetings.
Mm-hmm.
2 of our meetings we discussed that. So, but he would be best suited to give kind of insight into why that's the slogan.
So, you're right, you gotta start with a vision statement. Otherwise, if there's no vision, it's hard to direct where it's headed. So we kind of incorporated, we had 3 or 4 different elements we were looking at. We may end up adding something as we go along, something we may not have realized we needed, but the collaboration and abundance for everybody, it's kind of why we're all here. We want something more. And collectively we do that. Economic growth and relate that to families and being able to have affordable housing and being able to live here, but also have your family live here with you. It's important to us. And then also realizing that we can't just have this to ourselves. We've got to share it with the world. How do we share that with the world? That will be incorporated into the general plan. So we felt that was an element that we wanted to address as well.
Okay. Any other comments from anybody related to that?
Rod, I just wanted to comment one more thing, that I just want everyone to keep an open mind and to not get hung up on numbers and acreages right now, you know, just to focus on this vision statement that we have.
Yeah, with that vision statement, like Sean said, we wanted to focus it into 3 main areas. One is the community feel. So we wanted a vision statement that would kind of encompass how we wanted our community to feel, and that's where we got the collaboration. And then the next one we wanted to focus on making sure we did have some business in town. And so we and then tie that back in with the community and families. And then finally, because we live here, felt like we needed to address the visitors that we were gonna have in our vision. That was the three main points we wanted to have.
Okay. Is this the first time the council has heard this? Not the first time. So you've had some exposure to this. Any comments from the council at all? So far, so good. Feel reasonable alignment to how they came together with that and what it says?
I think it's a great measure.
Okay. Cool. All right, so we'll jump into some of the elements. The way we're going to try to handle the rest of the evening is sort of, in a way, an executive summary session. We started just a few weeks ago with what? 150 to 200 page document that gathered all the information in and really constituted, at that moment, the general plan report. Frankly, my experience dictates that nobody wants to sift through a 150 page document that's a living, breathing, dynamic piece. So guess what we do? We take all of that and go through a similar process to this. So at this point, we're down to something in the order of 20, 30 pages, which we anticipate will ultimately include some of that 200 pages in appendices and things of that sort. But the guts, the bones, the meat of this thing is going to be somewhere in the order of 20, 30 pages, not including maps.
Yeah.
And there are going to be a bunch of those. So we intend to depict everything that we can relative to land use, infrastructure, any of those things. We'll talk about them in the general plan, and then we'll depict them in maps, so that as you're trying to translate this general plan into updated ordinances, or even evaluating future opportunities for development and weighing it against your ultimately adopted general plan, that won't be a cumbersome process. It won't be super debatable. It'll be somewhat transparent and fairly clear. All right, so let's jump to the environmental element and talk about some of the specific hot spots or goals. You want to take that one?
Do you want me to just go through it all, or just talk about the goals that?
However you'd like to do it, however you choose to do it is how we're going to do all of them. So do
That means everyone
a really
wants to
good
raise.
job.
Okay, let's see. So out of the public meetings, I'm going to talk about the top desires regarding the environment.
Why don't we back up and tell them sort of how we organize this
Okay.
in terms of the layout?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So it's laid out, so we have information on current conditions, how it currently is. And then we talk about the desires, which that's all the information that was gathered from the public comments, open houses, and the surveys. And then we talk about the goals or the integration of some of these pieces, how we will do it if they come into play here. So the desire for the environmental section, for the desires that we got out of it, for preservation, the importance to preserve the view of the night sky. That was very, very important. Also energy conservation. And then the sensitivity to the environment, talking about all buildings need to be sensitive to social, aesthetic, and environmental needs. We want to designate areas of restricted development due to highly sensitive natural characteristics. Such areas may include significant ecological, archaeological, and water resources. If we go into the goals then, we want to preserve character and integrity, which would require adequate infrastructure existence.
So you're going to hear that theme a lot. So I think the leadership of the town understood this even before we got to this place. But there are some infrastructure needs that will drive a lot of what's going to happen in this community going forward. Some of them are not going to get solved tomorrow, and certainly will not get solved by just a few words in the general plan. But you got to start somewhere. And so some of the infrastructure stuff that really supports the overall vision and the general plan, and ultimately the ordinances and other work that you'll do in response to this new adopted general plan, that really becomes how you see that vision that we just talked about come into place.
Can I
Yeah.
ask a question on that? You mentioned character and integrity. Those are quite ambiguous terms, and I do like that for a general plan. But for this purpose, how are you guys defining character and integrity?
You want me to take it? Okay, so we heard a lot about the underlying culture, the rural community, sustaining the quality of life that exists for why people moved here in the first place. And that sort of is a foundational piece of this. Contrasting that with the need to respond to growth pressure, particularly along the highway corridor. So what we're really trying to say there, maintain what's valuable to people in town, and we can define that a little further as well. Although, as you just I pointed out, the identification of some of that stuff is really left to you guys as you push past that. But if it's not clear in terms of what we're suggesting, then yeah, we're gonna dive deeper into it. But that's what we were trying to capture. Does that make sense? Does that feel reasonable? Okay.
Okay, so the next one is encourage conservation. Reduce overall water consumptions with site design and landscape plants. And preserve natural drainage passages to avoid flooding and require new development to maintain and enhance them.
So I can jump back in on that one. Now I've got my town engineer hat on, and we're talking to the developer of, or the people who now own Sierra Bella subdivision. And I'm mentioning to them that from the town engineer's spot, we're probably going to need to condemn a couple of the existing lots because we have natural drainage running right through them. And unless that developer takes some steps to mitigate that, have to take some steps to make sure that whoever buys those properties is protected against the natural drainage that, to the best of my view, is flowing right through them. And so we had a discussion about how that would work, i.e. they're going to have to take some accountability for the drainage as it gets into their subdivision, because as all of you know, once we start building homes, guess who gets called when there's a flood? It's not the developer anymore. It's, if they have his number, it's that guy. Or any of the rest of you if they happen to have your number in front of that one. And we just need to mitigate some of that. We don't have the money to be pushing into flood damage around town. And so one of the things that we're going to get back with the Planning Commission relative to this element, the environmental element, is putting some very clear and concise documentation in the ordinances that requires developers to manage the natural drainage, not just the calculated drainage off of their site. Because that's only part of the solution. We already have some issues around town that we're dealing with that are related to this. We want to solve that problem pretty definitively through this process.
Okay, night sky preservation, set aside areas and continue to restrict lighting to low and downward.
You guys have already done some work on the lighting ordinance, and that's sort of what the intent of that is. So we're just reinforcing that and suggesting, just based on input, that there might be some places that we can designate around town to preserve night sky.
Views preservation, pleasant viewscapes are good for visitors, but the reason to
Do you agree with that?
So it's views preservation, pleasant viewscapes are good for visitors, but the reason to work at view preservation is for the quality of life for those fortunate enough to live in Virgin Town.
Do we want to discuss that a little bit?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I'm driving through town at whatever speed I happen to be choosing, depending on how many other folks are on the road. And sometimes that means I'm going 25, and sometimes that means I might be going 75 or 80. Having said that, as a passerby, I'm just catching the views kind of in this way, right? But in terms of the people that live here, we'd really like to be able to preserve that kind of skyscape around town, so that as you're just walking around town or mowing your lawn or whatever, that's still something that's preserved for you as a community. And that's what we're saying.
So we're talking like, in relation to what we're doing, sign stuff and building heights, things like that. Okay.
Right. Right. Does that strike you as a meaningful value? You think we should can that and move on to something else?
You don't think skyscrapers along the highway would do it?
I just love them in the Middle East, or some of those really cool places where they can't stop building these giant skyscrapers. I just think that's a great place for
That one in Dubai.
It's pretty amazing. So, are you resonating with that?
You're talking about building,
So what we're talking about is some sort of planning that manages the scale of things, so that you preserve viewscapes around town. And that's not necessarily meaning every single location in town is guaranteed to be able to see a beautiful red rock in the southern direction or whatever. But what we're saying is we heard that. We heard that as a value, and we want to do some things that make that happen. And it does mean things like heights, signage, some of that kinds of stuff.
And that's our example.
Thoughts, comments?
no, I definitely think we need to have height, we need to preserve that.
Okay.
I look at the motel every day I drive by, I just think if that was 3 stories.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
personally wouldn't like that.
Yeah. And that's a great example, Mayor. Now that it's up and we see it's not finished, of course, as we all know, but we have the scale of it, right? And you can see it in terms of its scale, reasonably well done in that regard. Yes, we can pick holes in it to whatever degree we choose to. But in terms of what we could have had, yes, in terms of a 6-story, single tower hotel structure, we got a pretty good program there, from my perspective, and from a perspective of, did we preserve this kind of value set? Does that make reasonable sense in terms of what we're trying to accomplish here? I think it's a decent example of sort of some of what now is the structure that we would have envisioned, right? And is that, are we looking at that structure now and going, oh crap, are we?
I'm not. I don't.
Some of us are? Did I hear a yes? What? Talk about it.
It looks great from my house.
Outside of mine, right?
So you're in Rio de Sion? Okay, so it's out. You put it out there. Thank you for your courage. We heard a lot of that. But we heard a lot of that from everyone depending on where they were in town, right? We heard comments about that from the central part of town. Let's not do anything like that here.
I would like to share.
You want to share? I love it. So we got a bunch of that comment from the west side, and there's some merit to that, especially when you consider Desert Gardens is right up against the highway. But we heard that from the east side too. And the truth is, I think what we're coming back with is, yeah, I'll get to share in a little bit of that. Because the reasonable commercial development is going to be in corridors along the transportation corridors as well, right? So what we're talking about is taking a swath all the way across town and designating some commercial. We're gonna recommend. We'll get into that a little later, but we're gonna recommend some different zoning than what you currently have for some of it. But we're looking at commercial along the corridors and including the new Kolob Road for reasonable commercial. So.
I think Jay has a
Yeah.
You know, I have a vision when I come here tonight, we would have a handout for you folks, so that we could follow along, play and bring your paper. But I think, that would be a great thing if you guys had those next time we have a meeting, pass out, so we can be on the same page, looking at what we're talking about.
Point taken.
Have a great.
Okay, and we actually viewed this more as direct face-to-face discussion, but we will absolutely incorporate that as we go forward.
Thank you.
And that's the summary on the environmental section.
So who's got the environmental section? Okay. What you need to be thinking about is did we catch the critical issues? Did we miss anything? What gaps need to be filled? What red lines do you kind of envision? And so that's kind of where that's coming at you. You'll receive the copy of the environmental element with some of the preliminary stuff. And everybody has a different packet. So you're going to get your specific element or elements. No, just element, right? Everybody.
A couple people have.
Had two.
Oh, that's okay. Somehow I thought that might be the case. Anyway, you'll receive your packets specific to those assignments at the planning and zoning level, and we'll share that out. But they get their first crack at it, and we'll share that out after you've had a little bit of time to get back in it.
So, how much with the stuff you guys are presenting tonight relates to what we currently have in the plan?
In the current plan?
The current plan. Is this stuff we need to add in that wasn't there, or is this stuff that you noticed that we need to change it, or?
No, in comparing, and I mean, there hasn't been hours and hours spent comparing it, but a lot of the comment, it's very similar to what was originally.
So you're looking at a full rewrite, formatting everything else,
Yes.
rather than just taking what we have and.
Right, and that'll be part of the appendices as well, the current one that you have.
So I would say, for an example, there's some stuff about the history
Right,
and
and all
population demographics and all that in the front end of this.
But yeah, just.
That's
the-
coming back
The
in.
portion that we're talking about as far as the goals and policies and things like that are going to fit what you guys are coming up with, not particularly pulled
Correct.
from what they plan on.
Correct.
Right.
Okay,
Does that make sense?
yeah.
Is that better?
In there we like, but it's gotta be stuff that's gotta go as well.
Well, and there was stuff in, and this is it.
Right.
It's been a working document for us virtually throughout this process. There were a lot of things we liked about this. And we have tried to incorporate those. What you're getting tonight is the executive summary of that. So
Yes.
it's the really melded down version.
So the one thing, when you guys are working on this proposal that that I'm gonna critique pretty heavily that I don't wanna see, is I don't wanna see a lot of fluff. Like, I don't wanna see a lot of fluff stuff in there, I just want, I envision the general plan being straight to the point. We want this, not big, long paragraphs explaining
Because you don't want to
and.
read all, yeah, right,
Yes.
okay.
So, yeah.
This is not the first time you said that, and I hope that what you see back,
Well, yeah,
it really is a response to that. We've
Right.
tried to do that.
yeah, that's, I just wanted to put that out,
Yes.
so as you guys are writing in those
Yes.
summaries, don't waste a lot of time.
Did that seem like a reasonable, that's a one-page executive summary of the entire element.
That's fine.
Yeah.
And I think kind of the direction we wanted to go as well is when we start incorporating our maps for each section, right? There'll be a lot of maps, like Rod said earlier. You know, pictures say 1,000 words, you know, and we wanted to be very clear in our mapping. And so when you look at the map associated with each section, or the maps associated, it's very clear and very straightforward in understanding what is being portrayed on the map, and then what you get in the statement that follows or proceeds will be able to, you know, help decipher what's going on there as well. So you get both from both sides. I think that's something that we really tried to incorporate.
Okay. You want to jump into the land use element? You want me to take that one? We talked about how big of a deal this one is. And so our internal discussion has been the infrastructure may be sort of at the root of what we can really envision ultimately in terms of financial or better said, economic feasibility. But the land use piece is where a lot of the passion exists around town. And so we've spent a considerable amount of time on that piece, as is the case with general plans normally. So
For me, helping to write this too, I'm learning that, I mean, there's, like, the environmental doesn't stop in that section. It all just, you know, it flows into the land use, and it flows into the housing, and the housing flows into the land use, so it's all one big document. So, you know, we've got to stay open that way as well, that it just doesn't end here and end here in these sections.
So on land use, what we really heard as the visionary statements, the desired pieces, as we've categorized it in our setup, we heard a lot about private property protection and private property rights. And so that's, from our perspective, that's one of the guiding principles of this general plan going forward. The next one that we identified was the village downtown center, which we've talked a little bit about related to the central core, which is right there. It's the highway corridor along the more finitely developed part of town, what we're calling the central core. And we'll identify all of these things through the mapping, and we're going to have you guys help us draw the lines on some of that stuff as well. But we just think that needs to be a walkable area, a neighborhood kind of place. There was some discussion about town services and facilities could be somewhere located within that context. So that's that piece, the village town center. We'll talk about that a little bit more because we're coming back to you with a recommendation for a new zone that actually exists, but is not part of your ordinances. Orderly growth. The essence of that is we're going to lay some things out. You know, we've talked about commercial corridors. There was a lot of value, and we heard a lot about what are we doing about reasonable housing in terms of value and cost, and how can we incorporate that? We heard, can we figure out a way to encourage families to live and stay here? What that means is a little bit of different, a little different view of how all of the residential development is going to take place. We're going to need some different kinds of residential development, and we'll talk about that a little bit.
I
Yeah.
was reading in the League of Cities
Yeah.
Utah, and it says the results of an affordable housing assessment, and it has it, for instance, towns are exempt. So would that apply to,
Yeah, we are not required by statute because of the size of our population. But what we're coming back to you with is, we heard a lot about that. And it still seems to be a value set that is held very largely in the community. Is that a fair statement? I'm seeing some yes and sort of some eh. So it's either yes or, okay. Yeah,
I'm wondering if this is talking more about Section 8 housing. Is that what this
it is.
referring
It's
to?
talking about the state and federally funded supported housing programs. That doesn't mean that we can't go and get some of that. It means we don't have to go and get some of that. We don't have to, we're not statutorily charged with that initiative.
Okay,
Yeah.
that answered my question.
Oh, okay. Any other comments related to that? You got a process. And that's what this is actually about. So trailhead improvements and river access was something that came up a fair amount. And we had some really interesting conversations about that related to, in some places there's a cliff, and what are you talking about in terms of river access and some of that kind of stuff. But in areas where it is possible and we still have developable ground, we heard a lot about how can that be integrated into an overall, if you will, trail system or transportation system or a community amenity. So in our minds, that's something that we are going to throw some ideas out in terms of how that can be done. And we've even thought about some connectivity of the existing park. Here he is! We've got a couple of parks, one right here, one up across the highway. Can you somehow connect those in a reasonable way? Does it make sense to do that? Or can they just be neighborhood parks? That's the discussion we want to have. Beyond that, we think there is an opportunity to do some trail connectivity that actually ties our community and its residents into some of the amenities that are around us. And we're not talking about building those so that necessarily all the guests can afford themselves of those, but they're not precluded either. But we're really looking at this as a community value, a way to connect neighborhoods. Thoughts?
No, we've talked about this extensively.
We have.
Yeah.
Are we getting there? Does that sound like reason?
Along with that, was there an element of relating to equestrian-oriented uses? I know that's what we had in there before.
I don't think there was not much comment about equestrian uses.
Not much comment, but there was before, so is
So,
that something?
and it was in the plan previously. It's something that as the liaison, wait a minute, who's got land use? Right there. You should address.
Yeah. We're just talking trails, are they trails for
Right.
hiking
Right.
horses, and that's why.
Our notion was we are not specifying what type of trail. We're simply saying it makes sense from the input that we got to think about connecting neighborhoods a little bit through some kind of a system. And really, again, focusing on the quality of life in the town as opposed to an amenity for people who would be visiting the town. But it will work in both ways. And then the next one we said was floodplain area management. We touched on that a little bit in terms of one piece of that. But we have a decent, all the way through the ordinances, some decent work done there. We really need to rise up in our level of sophistication to make sure that we are not making any mistakes as we review, and I'm talking more staff than you guys, make any mistakes about where we place buildings and how that's oriented relative to existing floodplains, and make sure we don't, again, create problems that we're gonna be saddled with going forward. And then economic enhancements was our last desired piece and land use element. Anytime that a developer comes into town and has a proposal for wanting to do something, they have a vested interest. Their intent is to get a return on their capital or whatever. Corollary to that, and in balance with that, ought to be, is it going to be a benefit to the town? Is it going to be a meaningful feature that makes sense for our community, either from an economic perspective or from an environmental or development perspective in general? So that's how, at a general planning level, we would want to weigh things. If it's not good for the town, why are we kind of thinking about it, right? And so then the $1 million question is, what do you mean by what's good for the town? We all have an opinion about that, right? And it's diverse. Well, we're going to try to narrow that view a little bit into the things that the town as a whole would really like to envision going forward. So does it have some kind of a benefit, even economic or otherwise? Is sort of one of the steps that we would look at in terms of land use. So goals, we said the same thing, and we did put a little more meat to this one, Sean. Preserve the basic character and integrity. And then we put some meat to that. We want to utilize development impact fees to provide adequate public facilities and services in a timely manner. We got to put, development needs to support it of its own piece, but the other thing that has to happen as we grow, we also have to make the budgets balance. Public Works still has to maintain all the roads, the new ones, and so on and so forth. So we want to strike that recommendations that actually fall more into a town financial perspective relating to new development. Pursue cooperation with government entities that administer and control areas bordering Virgin Town, including some notion of policies and activities which have cross-boundary impacts. So where that came from was a lot of discussion about, we got a lot of campers out there is kind of the primary discussion. There's more to it than that. Campers out there that are just enjoying passing through and parking it on BLM property or whatever, and we don't have a blessed say about any of that stuff. It's annoying. The option you have is annex all of that stuff, right? Not over my dead body. Please don't take that seriously. But we do really want to elicit some interagency cooperation, particularly through the leadership. And this comes back to town council more so than even planning and zoning. We want to have a say. We want to be able to have the same phone numbers that the guy whose house we just flooded is going to call you. Well, we want to have that Rolodex of numbers that we get to call at the county and other places. And they're going to help us. They're going to help us solve some of these problems that we don't really have any say in. And I think there's ways to set that up. And I think you guys are doing some of those things. That has to do with some of the meetings that the mayor has assigned a number of you to attend. We just experienced that, Leroy and I, and so divide and conquer really. That's a lot of what happens. So that's that. Orderly growth managed. Encourage the development, and in specific, I wrote this one just to get some discussion. Encourage the development of our RV parks, but in specific areas and in limited numbers. And so I'm literally saying, we've had a lot of discussion about RV parks. We heard it all the time, resonated throughout the entire community. They're not toxic waste dumps, folks. And there may be some room for those. But can we plan them and can we manage it so that the entire town doesn't get overrun by RV parks, that we end up with 40 of them, to be completely outrageous, but we're reasonable about it. We've had some discussions about some proposals that have come before, and some of the elements that were included in some of those were really pretty nice. Meaningful amenities, actually. So it's not a curse or anything. It's just something to be managed. Any comments about that? I hope there are. I wrote that purposefully. We did. We did.
I like that idea of limiting them and maybe controlling them by distances or.
Yeah, and thank you. And we'll take the hit a little bit on that, because I think we have some ideas as to where some of that makes the most sense. And I'm literally saying, you guys have got to take whatever we talk about and really put that into ordinance, and really manage that.
I remember one element that was pretty consistent throughout was also talking about free markets and how those, in this element especially, how that comes into play. I know we've talked about property rights, but how does a free market, how's that involved in this element?
So it's a balance, right? It's a balancing act. So, and the reason why I picked RVs in specific to tackle that entire sort of notion was, it's easy for me to say, envision your town with 40 RV parks. How many of you, that's your vision of the town? Raise your hand. Seriously, raise your hand. Everybody in the whole room, raise your hand. Is that your vision for town?
Would we care, or is it a vision? That's
Right.
really the question.
Right, I agree, but I'm just making the point that that's one of the places where I can sort of pick a polar end of it from each extremes and sort of have the discussion sort of come back to the middle, because we can all relate to that.
I think we need to be able to write that in such a manner that it's not set in stone that 3 is the magic number. Because as we go along and as we grow and stuff, the possibilities of needing 3 more may be very real. Right now, well, that's never here or there, but I think we need to be able to have it in there so that we can make it a living thing, kind of, so we can change it as we go along. Maybe we'll decide 2 is all we want, but
And actually, the hard work to getting into the quote unquote weeds of that really falls to, right? Back to your statutory. Are you so glad you volunteered for this job? Yeah, right. I do a lot. I'm just. Oh, I see. So I do a lot of work with planning and zoning commissions around the state, and all of them almost unanimously tell me I didn't really completely understand what I was getting into when somebody approached me and said, could you please do this for us or whatever. It's a big job. And yeah, getting into the details of that is not going to be a simple matter. And we'll help you with that. We'll provide some framework for that. And that's, again, why I put that one on the list in that level of specificness, because that's just really an example, but it's something that we got to reach out and get our arms around.
In my opinion, Virgin is in dire need of kind of camping. We don't like it all around us, but we don't do anything in town to benefit from it or to stop it. And the sooner we can come up with something on that, I think the better we are.
Yep. Yeah, and I concur with that. And again, that's why I thought it made sense to sort of set sort of some extremes and get some discussion related to that specific. But really, you just cited camping is, in my mind, slightly different than what I just stated in terms of RV, although similar uses, right?
Well, you need both, you can sit
Yep.
out on the
Yep.
Sheep Ridge Road.
Yep.
I mean,
Yep.
it's not only tents, it's RVs.
Dude, you know what's happening all around us, and it's not just this phenomenon here, but people are literally driving their tiny homes all around because instead of, they bought a tiny home not because they could only afford a tiny home, but they wanted to be able to drop it in the middle of Virgin for 6 months and then move off to some other location and do whatever it is they do in that spot. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon. It's not super helpful to municipal services.
I made the point for like a month to drive that road, we got a ranch out there. And on my way on that road, every time I drive, I stop and ask them people in them RVs, and they don't want to be there. They don't.
They prefer to be in a better place.
They just, but they can't find a place to park.
Yeah. Yeah. So the same thing with orderly growth. Encourage the development of higher density, lower cost housing adjacent to the commercial zones where access to public infrastructure is most likely to occur through new zoning. I'm looking up and I had to assess whether to you, and I don't know why, but that's, I'm looking right at you. What do you make of that?
Which one's that?
So I just read the third goal down on page 4.
Well, theirs may be different. because
Wonderful.
they-
Oh, did they distribute them? What have you got?
Page 5, house number.
No, this is, we're still on the land use element.
They're using the same one.
Rod,
Yeah,
I think the way you've written that makes a lot of sense, because we're talking about trying to do some new infrastructure with sewer systems and stuff like that. And if we have the only way we can do the higher density housing is gonna be if we can use that very element.
right.
And that's, we need to kind of have them at least semi-close.
Right. And so the notion that the planning commission initially is going to deal with is a commercial corridor buffered in some cases by higher density residential, moving to the more traditional residential communities. That's sort of how we've envisioned it. Not only because you can't sustain high density residential anywhere better infrastructure than exists in the larger lot portions of town. And the flip side of that is in the areas where we have established neighborhoods with larger lots, this is just me talking now, I would not love to see the next development on my back porch be a 4-story apartment complex. That's just not what I have in mind when I'm buying a larger lot in an established neighborhood. I have an expectation that I'm gonna live with neighbors that are somewhat like-minded in that regard. So I think it's a way to capture both pieces. Use the higher density residential as a buffer from the commercial zones, and still maintain the integrity of the existing neighborhoods with the larger lots. Reasonable concept?
Sounds good.
I think it's a reasonable concept, but you keep throwing exorbitant like 4-story, you know, which we don't even allow.
Right.
And 40 subdivision, or 40, mobile homes,
Yeah.
you know, mobile home. I mean, reminds me of Grand Canyon Trust years ago, was trying to take control of everything along the highway, and they had these fill up where they had these billboards, one after the other through there, you know, showing all this stuff, and all this is gonna happen and everything. It never happened. So I think, you know, throwing out these exorbitant, like that to make a point, kind of destroys, you know, the common sense of what we're trying to do. So anyway, I just appreciate, you know, that, let's keep it down to what, I mean, our.
Lose the drama.
Yeah, lose the drama.
Fair enough.
Relatable.
I gotcha.
Just relatable.
Yeah.
So that would be a specific goal, so that'd be something, using that as a buffer. But we've still got to identify, there might be locations or places that are suitable. And how do we write that in there without excluding those portions or those places that could be ideal for, you know, maybe a clustered CUP or something.
So I guess the argument that I'm making is the issues related to the infrastructure support at a municipal service would be one of the constraints that any of these developers would have to deal with. Saying there's ways to overcome constraints. So when you say there may be a really unique and beautiful spot where this is ideally suited, I'm going to say, is there a traditional sewer system that they can connect to? What does our water system look like in terms of connecting to that site?
Right.
And so I'm going to get down to the practical aspects of that. And yeah, if the developer can afford it, they'll pay for our infrastructure development and all of that. So you can't completely limit it from that view.
Yes.
But I think it is a constraint.
Rod, you don't necessarily have to have a sewer. I mean, they have systems now.
Correct.
They're more money, but
Correct.
it's getting closer to being
Agreed.
to where you could do it
Right.
without having
Correct.
municipal sewer.
Right, and so I agree with that, and we've already adopted some notions for how that could look, and we have some going on. It's clearly feasible at some levels. It works for some development. There's no reason to wipe that off the map and say, nope, can't do it just simply because we can't provide it in the traditional manner. I'm simply saying it does create a constraint.
Well, I personally think, sewer system along the way for a long time out for Virgin. So look at the numbers and we can't afford it.
Yeah.
I mean, the hope says that maybe we could hook on to Ash Creek if it came up the hill. That might be affordable, but to put in a sewer system, come on, $10 million to do it.
Exactly.
And then maintain it.
Yeah, yeah.
So I mean, these developers are gonna have to use some of these other systems
Yes.
until something. you know,
Right. Right.
And I think the key needs to be, if they do have those systems, that's great, but they need to set themselves up to wherever the time comes, we do have municipal water, the connectivity is there. Because I've seen some pretty bad situations with that.
But I mean, that's gonna be their expense.
Yeah, it's on them, in essence. And that still plays back to, there's a piece of ground, what's feasible for them, it's not for me to determine necessarily.
Residential, what do you call it, where you build, say you build on a quarter acre. I mean, they can put them systems in for them subdivisions,
Yes.
if it's feasible for them.
Yep. And we're gonna have to get into the weeds about that topic, as we get through this process.
So I think also too, when we're considering sewer and infrastructure, and we all know if Ash Creek comes up the hill, it's cheaper to look into them. But I think we also need to remember and consider, that we live in the desert, and someday, if we do our own plant, that would give us access to a lot of water that may be extremely valuable in 50, 60 years. So just going the cheapest, just going the cheapest route to dump the water to someone else may not be the best idea for the town. You know, you might should maintain control of that water.
So, we're talking about land use, Sean, right now in your piece, but the fact is that notion comes all the way back through on the infrastructure piece that Josh is gonna lead, and it It's a completely, who's got infrastructure? That's what I thought. It's a completely unique element. It's different than all the rest of them, and yes, it's more cumbersome because we felt like we had an obligation to describe some level of feasibility for the alternate systems on wastewater, what traditional systems might look like. So we've actually brought the master planning process back into this document. Now, it'll likely end up in the appendix, a lot of that information, but we want that to be in front of people. How much it's going to cost if we just up and decide, oh yeah, we're just going to go traditional sewer, which is, okay, I just did it again. I got a tiny bit dramatic because it's not feasible. So we just have to deal with those issues.
I was going to say, I'm familiar with one over here at the new motel, but not only is it expensive, they have to have a licensed person maintain that. You know, it's got to be somebody state approved and state licensed that maintains it, or, you know, checks it. I'm not sure what the schedule is, but it's quite regular.
Yeah.
Make sure that thing
Yeah.
stays functioning.
Yeah, and we don't disagree with the mayor's assessment that we're a ways out on that.
Oh, yeah.
But we also contend that if you don't start some of the planning process today, we're going to be 10 years from now, and we're still going to be way out on some of this stuff. And so we'd like to put some things out there that at least push the discussion proverbially down the road a little ways. Fair enough? Okay. We talked. We're talking a little bit here about adoption of a village commercial zone to minimize the negative impacts on current development and residents, and to capture some tax and service revenues to benefit the community, and encourage contiguous, interactive commercial sharing of parking lots and other infrastructure. So our vision for some of that is small scale. And we even thought about things like, what would it look like if we had some of the parking areas as a value set? And of course, we don't always mandate planning perspective, but what if you had some of the parking behind the commercial corridor, and you had some of the commercial storefronts kind of close to to a walkable portion of the highway. And then if you buffered that with higher density residential, is that a compatible shared use? So you're not building an entire, if you will, asphalt jungle, which happens to be my entire living. I did it again, didn't I? But to downsize that stuff a little bit in terms of the scale, and economize a little bit in some of those uses. Share them a little bit. Is that a possibility? And can we facilitate that? Does it make sense at all? It's something that we've knocked around. Now it's time for you guys to assimilate that and tell us we're up in the night or whatever.
Well, I think the problem's gonna be getting somebody
The coordination.
start with it.
Right.
And seriously
Right. Yes.
buy those
Right.
property and put those businesses in.
Right, agreed. And I think that was a really good point. You can advertise it all you want, but if nobody comes, all you got left is a billboard, right? And that's a valid point.
I think we're already working on commercial habitation issues and things like that, so it would fit in to that, so.
Okay.
Well, and I think, like you were saying, in some areas of town, especially here's center core, maybe changing the setback rules and letting the businesses be up a little closer if they were willing to put it there.
Yeah.
Because it would help.
Yeah, just from the perspective of where are all the vehicles that are coming through town, if we're actually inviting them to stop and buy a hot dog or get the tire, the tube on their tire repaired on their way to the trail or whatever. Where are we putting all these people? And are we really ruining some of our community by the parking situation? And I don't have to go very far up the road to tell you that parking is a big deal if you don't manage it a little bit proactively. Okay? So we're trying to get our arms around that a little bit in sort of the general concept of how that might work better than what we see around us a little bit.
I
But
really like the idea of working
On some.
Yeah.
yeah, it'll be, it's a dialogue, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think that brings up, it kind of brings up a pretty good concern, especially, and that's something I hadn't thought of before, was shifting the buildings closer to the road and allowing more parking in the rear. We currently require parking in the rear, but we also require huge frontage. So, yeah, I can see that in a lot of areas of town, that current mandate actually creates a huge amount of problems for the neighborhoods that are. So that's an interesting thought.
dude, you just made my whole night. Really. I mean, that's the kind of thinking that we're trying to sort of push into the process. And I really appreciate that, because it might be a dumb idea. You're going to give us some feedback. This is not our first rodeo in this regard. Hopefully, a lot of this is going to resonate to some degree, and we got to stay practical and keep our feet on the ground and all of that, and make it work. So that's beautiful.
The old part of Cedar City was like that. All the storefronts were right out on the sidewalk, parking behind. You go up there, that's still the way it is right now. The old part of
Right.
Cedar City. But their lighting was not very good behind, and they run into quite a few safety
They
issues
did.
back, people being accosted and stuff like that. So, those are some things, I think it's a good idea, I mean, walk up and down there, but normally if you have parking out front, somebody's watching.
Point taken.
In the back, they're not.
Right. So the benefit we have that's different from what happened in Cedar City is we are talking about more or less a linear development process as opposed to a block development process. Part of the reason why there were some issues there was because the other half of the block was also closed in by structures. And so there was no views into those areas. In a linear notion, you're talking about fairly long stretches of view space. And if we go back to some of this notion of shared parking and some of that, there's going to be people that are right across the parking, at the other end of the parking lot, who are parking there because that's where their condo is. And so we hope to be able to mitigate that in that regard. But it's a valid point, and it has become an issue in a lot of places.
Well, we kind of talked about that a little bit in the environmental part too. Rather than just having that stringent lighting, we can create these zones. So we can create zones where lighting would be allowed to be brighter. And I think that would be a zone that would be appropriate for that behind those buildings.
Yeah.
So we kind of discussed
Yeah,
that a little
point
bit.
taken. So the last one is just floodplain, and we're suggesting as a goal, provide clarity and improve the enforcement of existing town floodplain and drainage requirements. Because our feeling is you got some pretty good stuff already in place. You just have to come back to staff and force us to be accountable for some of that stuff. Yeah.
I was gonna say, you look up at Sierra Bella, and they did what they were required to do.
They did.
And then they got a big flood come down.
Yeah.
I mean, but the maintenance, there wasn't any. And, and they're gone.
Yeah.
So who does that fall on? It's gonna fall back on us.
Yeah, and that's how it always happens. In that particular case, we get the benefit of a second chance, right? because somebody's now coming in and saying, hey, we want to re-envision Sierra Bella. We get that there's infrastructure already in place. And I had a fairly lengthy conversation with them about the notion of higher densities in that subdivision. And really, is it a possibility? Yeah. Does it make a ton of sense? Maybe not, because all the infrastructure is already under a paved road, right? So how much of that are we makes sense? To some degree, back to the private property piece, hey, have at it, dude. Knock yourself out. Come back and help us make sense out of that if that's where you want to go with that. Build the required sewer program and whatever you need. Let's see what that looks like. Let us assimilate that kind of an application. But initially, I was just simply saying to them, guys, you just have to understand, it's from an infrastructure perspective, that thing is built. So anything that you want to do to change that is different from coming into Greenfield and lay a new pipeline.
I think on your floodplain bill, we better be real active or whatever, if these guys are building, because the last 3 months, how many issues, there's been 3 issues with this same thing. The developers changing the stream and then they get flooded.
Yeah.
So I really believe that we need to really look at that on the engineer side and the town side and not let the developers ruin it, because someone pays for it in the end.
Thank you. And that's our view of it as well. It sounds like we're aligned on that, so that's good.
If I could just go back real quick to the adoption of.
No, we're out of time.
Commercial zone.
Completely out. We knew land use was going to be a chunk of this, so.
Just to throw out something in planning and zoning, we've been discussing not the increase of more zones and different things, but actually the consolidation of. So take that into consideration as maybe you're gonna have to sell it to us. If you've got
Understood.
If you've got a new zone, we're gonna have to figure out either how to consolidate that with others or some other way. The idea of commercial along the highway, love it. Why not? Why aren't we doing that? But how are we going to do that effectively? We're going to try to see how we can consolidate that so it's not too.
So we got it, and so what I use the analogy of my wife's budget. Every time I want to get a new golf club, she says, "Which golf club are you going to take out of your bag and sell back? Because you're only going to have 14 clubs in your bag. So if you want a new one, you got to figure out which one you're going to dispose of." So I think in that context, I'm hearing you. Let's not overcomplicate this. Okay, thank you. Okay, parting comments. We're turning the page from.
Let's go. Let's move.
Okay,
Yeah.
Housing element. It's time for me to be quiet again. I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, yeah?
No more drama. No more drama.
We'll get through this. Okay, so for the housing element.
Who's got that?
Florida.
That's okay.
So the desired areas that came up a lot were affordability. Current and future housing needs to be affordable. The town may need to review and revise planning, zoning, and development regulations to allow adequate supply for a variety of housing types and programs offered by the state and federal government. All housing needs to meet the housing needs of a population with varied income levels from high to low, and moderate families and senior citizens. Then we have design quality and maintenance, the quality of neighborhoods and how vital it is to the overall quality of the community. It's high on the list. All housing, despite the cost, needs to be built with quality and maintained to last.
What do you mean by quality?
As far as materials used,
Like a manufactured home or modular home, or are you talking stick-built home? Is that quality?
it's
I
still
know
pretty
that's
good, right.
hard.
I think that sometimes,
It's just a buzzword, quality. It's too
right,
ambiguous.
well, right, again, and again, we can define that some more, but I'm thinking, more, you know, from hearing people talk, they hear low-income housing. I think a lot of people just think,
Tin
you know,
sheds?
yeah. You know, just throw up these little project-type houses, you know, that aren't going to last. But that's not gonna be the case. It needs to follow certain, whether that's in ordinances or.
And they have a number of those
permits
in
and things.
place, right.
Right.
Kids' houses in St. George.
Yeah.
You get 10 years out of them.
And that's it, and then you move.
It's interesting
But
that,
that's,
you know, we all talk about affordable housing. Everybody wants affordable housing, but nobody wants to have their house next to it because it'll bring value to their house.
yeah.
So, anyway,
It's gonna be tough.
it's kind of a catch-22, I guess.
It's an enigma, yeah.
They can build next to my house.
So any thoughts to put a little meat on that, discussion?
We're talking affordable. 100,000, 200, 300?
So I think that's sort of dictated by the economic outlay. I think what we heard from the community is we want to price ourselves out of our own community. And so what that means is, what is the baseline value throughout the community right now, and what does that look like in 10 years with increased property values and all of that? Are we, can we do something to maintain reasonableness in that regard?
So the number we kind of talked about in planning only about the $250,000 range. So
I was gonna say,
$200,000 and $250,000.
I think you need to go down.
Oh, it'd be nice to go down, but you can't go down.
It would be hard to go down.
But that number's always going to change too.
Yeah, it depends on the
economy, right, and what's going on.
50,000, you're talking about a $1,300 a month.
It's not so much the houses,
So you get around.
the land.
Yeah, it probably
It's like
coin.
buying a car,
Well, that's
and
part of
you
it.
got insurance, you know, so, yeah. So-
And again, I think it probably goes back to, in my idea, you know, going back to what we talked about with the other ones, is there's probably areas throughout town that would be possibly more suitable for certain types of housing. You know, like I'm just thinking about Cedar City, where I live currently, and you know, it seems like there's certain areas or certain subdivisions or whatever that were more suited to that type of housing, you know, like a first-time home buyer type of thing, where they come in and, you know, it's a, whatever it is, you know, 1,200 square foot, slab on grade, 2-car garage. And then there's, you know, obviously I live kind of just on the outside of a community that, you know, I think the smallest house in there is 4,500 square foot, you know, and so that's the smallest end of that housing community. And so, you know, I think I think that's kind of what you guys are getting at. Yeah, we'd like to see something maybe more along those lines, and I think there's maybe areas that would be more well suited. But
It's not the only housing value, right?
Yeah.
Just capturing that notion is just one piece of the overall housing piece, and you get to deal with that with us.
When I say affordable housing, it's not gonna happen until you have smaller lot size.
Yeah.
And until you have sewer, I don't think it's economical for a subdivision to put in one of these self-contained septic systems for houses.
Well, they're getting to the point now, I've been visiting with one of the engineers, and he's got some plans and stuff that for residential that is not completely outrageous. So, I mean, there are some possibilities, and things are changing,
Right.
you know, quite regular on that note.
Yeah.
Then I go back to the developer come in and put them on quarter-acre lots. They sell out quarter-acre for $100,000, they're gonna sell it for that. I mean, they're not gonna keep it down just for.
Just because we want them to, right? It's driven by, and I got to tell you, it's a battle, and you're going to fight it, because this area is beautiful. It's It's attractive. The passerby, I've talked to several people just in the last little while who are not current residents of Virgin. They're essentially visitors. But how did you come here? Well, it might have been the advertising back in New York City or whatever. But once they see it, I'm telling you, they're saying, geez, sweetheart, maybe we ought to move out to Utah when we retire, or whatever the conversation. And it's going on in a bunch of the cars going up and down the highway, right through your town.
I'm work in Springdale a lot, and we're getting to the point up there that a lot of either the elderly or the people with low income are basically getting forced out.
And that's also, affordable housing also covers that as well, because, you know, your income has to be a certain level to qualify to get into that house. And of course, you know,
But how can you, I mean, somewhere we need to address so they can't be pushed out.
Correct. And I guess that would be maybe, I don't know if that's in your ordinances.
And I don't know that.
You know,
We
but
don't have
that, again, it's
anything
just,
No.
present, but
right,
we haven't had to deal with it because we don't have anything under an acre.
Right,
right,
Yeah.
right,
As we get into that, then some of those things are gonna have to be looked at.
right.
right.
I mean,
And you're not in total control, mind you. We aren't and you aren't. And let's just acknowledge that as well. Some of the economic dynamics are not going to be completely manageable. Things are going to happen. And frankly, this is one of those proverbial freight trains that's already left the station to some degree. The economics of this area is a national issue in some degree.
I think two other things you gotta take into account, the jobs to support the income in the houses. The second thing is you can't control that. Say you get $100,000 housing development, you're not gonna guarantee it's just gonna be young families coming in. It's gonna be people who buy those out to rent them or.
Oh, sure.
So we just can't control all those elements of it. There's just a lot more into it.
And on this, the second page of that, there's a goal that says adequate identification, you know, and it says adopting reasonable standards and ordinances for short-term rentals and high-density housing.
But you guys are already working.
And you guys are working, yeah, and it's just making sure that you know, we have that vision.
They said today that Hurricane Selma are giving 40 building permits a week.
This is another little drama. You're going to have to bear with me. That's where I'm at right now, and I'm thinking, I want to move up the hill. Buy me another 20 years of some of that nonsense, right? Oh my gosh. I mean, I didn't know there was that much lumber in the state of Utah.
well, I don't know what St. George is selling every day, but when you take the parkway across the back,
Yeah.
I mean, I can remember when there was nothing out there.
Nothing.
Not even a cow,
Right.
hardly.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
big.
Yeah.
Okay, and then we have the adequate identification, was one of the other desires.
What does that mean?
Land should be identified for adequate housing sites appropriately zoned with development standards and public services and utilities needed to facilitate high density and residential development.
Just exactly kind of what you were alluding to, Mayor. Okay.
You know, the thought I just had on the quality of homes, that would just be said in our ordinances.
Right. Right.
How the house is built.
Right. And Sean already knew the answer to that when he said, what do you mean by quality? He knew the easiest answer that I could take to him was, but we're going to try to put some context to that. But yeah, that's for the community to decide in real terms.
Okay, so the goal, and I'm not gonna say the first goal because keep in mind these goals are not in any specific order. We're gonna go back to affordable housing again, because I'm sure Virgin doesn't want to be Springdale and run out the elderly and the families, you know, and the lower incomes. We want to keep it so everyone can live here and afford to live here. Quality and maintenance, identify areas of needed housing, rehabilitation and maintenance programs, utilize a variety of available state and federal programs which focus on housing rehabilitation for those currently in need. Some of these are community development block grants, home and weatherization programs regionally available through the 5-County Association of Governments. New development should be reasonably compatible with and complementary to existing structures in both scale and architecture. Street patterns and trails within the neighborhoods should be designed to be direct and interconnected to encourage walking and bicycling. And that will also tie into the circulation element as well. Adequate identification, adopting reasonable standards for short-term rentals and high-density housing, and maintaining larger lots. It is high priority to maintain the larger lot rule setting, especially in the neighborhoods which are already established. Limit denser subdividing in already partially developed, well-established neighborhoods.
So what we're trying to address there, and it could be a real hot spot, so we want you guys to really chime in with us on this one. We're talking about smaller parcels that are still green space, that could very easily be subdivided many times over into smaller density. There may be some good examples of that, but what we're saying in this piece is, if it's right in the middle of a 1 acre, well-established neighborhood, maybe that's not the best place to consider that kind of a development. And again, that's something to really consider. I know it can be a hot spot all the way back to the initial value set about private property rights and so on. But our take on that is there will be reasonable places for those kind of pieces, but when you've got a fairly large, well-established neighborhood that just happens to have some open spaces, we think it makes sense to try to maintain the integrity of that neighborhood to some degree. And you guys can, you know, put the meat to the bones about that, but that's what we're saying as a value set. Okay, circulation. So, do you want me to run that one? Do you want to jump into that?
Sure, yeah.
Which one is sure?
Yes.
You want me to do that?
Or I can do it.
Do it.
Yeah,
Go.
I got it. Yeah, we can go it. Yeah. So yeah, circulation. So the current condition is it's currently not safe for pedestrians to cross SR9 as traffic increases and continues to increase. And that, you know, as I drove into town today, it was pretty evident that there was a line of cars from one end of town to the other, and you see that. And when I was here last time, it was one of the Saturday work meetings, and it was I think maybe 10 years ago, it used to be kind of a spring, summer, fall time deal, and you had the break during the winter, but it seems like the traffic is pretty constant now all year long. You know, it's not just a designated time of year when the weather gets nice, it's all time. And so I think that's something to take into consideration and remember that, you know, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a problem, but it's an issue, right? And you see it all year long, and so.
And we want to be careful about saying it's not safe, but in some regards, you got to put it on the table, right? I'm picturing my baby daughter with her stroller and her newborn trying to get across that street so she can get to the post office, and I'm not really excited about that proposition today, right? I'd like that to be a simpler process and more of a not a grandpa instinct chiming in and saying, "Oh my gosh, let me drive you." I don't even want to have to think about that. I want to be able to just get across there if I want to pick up the mail from this side of the town, and walk there without even thinking about that I'm going to get mushed.
So what we're gonna look at then is either putting in a light or else doing an overpass or an underpass.
Yeah,
We got an underpass right at City Park right there.
yeah.
May take a little work, but there's.
So we actually edited some of my creative writing in that one because I had actually written stuff about a scenic overpass or a subway, a walkable subway or something, and we sort of, the team decided that I was being a little bit too colorful on that stuff too.
Yeah, so just the 4 desired segments that we have right there: safe, convenient systems, and whatever those are. Provide a safe and convenient, efficient system of transporting people and goods to and from and through the community, right? And that means by mode of walking, riding our bike, riding a horse, even right. That was brought up, and making sure that there's safe travels for those as well, and shuttles for visitors or going from park to park or whatever. I know I haven't actually been down here during the Red Bull Rampage.
We choose not to. No.
Right, no, yeah, but actually no, last year I was actually. Last year we went and hiked Kolob Arch from this side in. We drove by, and I couldn't believe how many people were just all over, right? So we want to make sure that there's safe travel ways for everybody, and and mostly for the people that live here, right? We want to make sure that you guys are allowed to, get to where you need to go, to and from work, home, and your kids are safe and your families are safe, and then
Basically, the only way to get anywhere now is to get in your car and go.
yeah,
Trying to get across the road up there, I mean, we'll wait as much as 15, 20 minutes sometime to get a clearance, between both ways.
Yeah.
yeah.
So there is a vehicular issue there in terms of this element and a walkable
Yes,
issue.
definitely.
This element actually will speak to both of those.
Yeah. Another one is Sheep Ridge Road improvements. I'm not really familiar with that one. Really.
So we just decided to put it on the table. You all know Carolyn, right? She's my boss.
To get the cow out of the car.
Literally.
The cow.
I brought a cow home. Where was I now? Sheep Ridge Crossing. So the county, what did I say? So the county's got plans. We don't know exactly what's going to happen there, but I think we need to kind of try to assimilate that somehow into what that means to us. So that's, we got it on the table. Let's just put it that way.
And then there's shuttle systems and proper road and trail maintenance, which will, coincide. But in the future, as things, down the road, as things progress, and there are commercial zones and short-term rental properties that have people renting or whatever, you can develop a shuttle system and to help people lessen the traffic.
Of course, that's the county statewide initiative as well, and we're just trying to assimilate that somehow into what makes sense to us.
Kevin can give you an update on the services.
Okay.
I think you and Leroy went to that meeting today, so you probably know more than I do about it.
And actually, Leroy was there. I missed it.
Oh, you missed it?
I did.
It's just, they voted for it Friday and it passed $15 million.
For
For shuttle systems,
Shuttle system.
George, so I
George design.
couple of
like
stops here.
Harriet and Virgin and each one of the communities for parking rides.
So they're talking about the park and rides. I actually struck that from this particular document for today, because I know it's a little bit of a hot topic. We'll put it back in the program because I didn't know the status of it. But we've got to find some spots.
At least one spot, apparently.
Yeah. And initially they were talking about 2 spots.
Are they talking to Leroy or what?
Initially, they want two.
Yeah.
And I, in my discussion.
One on each end?
Yeah. They were talking.
And that's what we've heard
Maybe
too.
one that would have a park, a parking area. The other one would just be a, pick people up with a
Right.
parking area.
So from our perspective, does that represent an opportunity for the town? Or do we want to sort of skirt it to the outskirts, if you will? And really, we need to get a sense for that. Are you viewing that as an opportunity or a challenge?
I think
Yeah.
it's both.
Yeah, I do
I think
too.
it's an opportunity for us to make some money,
Yeah,
and it's a challenge to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And it's an opportunity for, like, say, the Fort. If he was willing to put a parking lot there, he would attract more business.
mm-hmm.
You know, so I think it's a real opportunity for the
Yeah.
town.
I was gonna say, I think it's, did I interrupt?
No,
I was just gonna say, I think if you look at what we have in place right now, the two places that could really benefit from it would be Fort Zion and the new motel over there. And I think both of them have the ability, well, I don't know about Andy so much, but they probably would have the ability to put a parking area big enough to accommodate, but just the motel itself, if that was full with 200 rooms and all of those cars stayed right there and just shuttled on into town, around Zion, that'd make a heck of a dent in the parkings. Not to mention the fact that you're gonna have to pay $22 parking space.
So,
That would be a real draw for the hotel, to tell them there's a shuttle service
Yeah.
to the park.
yeah.
if you're just out there and pick them up, go. That's hard.
Okay. So, who's got the
Well, I'm
circulation
sorry, real quick
element?
on that, just in some of the open houses as well, even the residents here in Virgin talked about how, you know, they used to go to Zion's or they would love to go back up there, but it's just crazy. And so with a shuttle system like that, it's very helpful for just the residents here to take that and to be able to go up and enjoy that
Right,
as well.
right now, even though just with the shuttle that they've got, people are standing in line over across the bridge over in the park maintenance.
Yeah.
They're standing in line over there sometimes 2 hours to get on a shuttle to go up the canyon.
I believe this was, set to go every hour and a half.
This one here.
The new one.
It'll be separate from the shuttle system.
Well, I'm
It
sure
is.
it would, but
Completely separate.
I'm just saying, it's still got a lot of standing around, but you just, well,
Just there'll be a.
you know, you don't have to at least find a place to park your car. And then find a place to get down to the, if you were being picked up here and took
Right.
up there, an hour and a half wait just is really not.
And I would honestly love to stand around down here than in the city somewhere.
Well, I think the parking, we just need to integrate that into some of our business area. So we don't have a parking lot just sitting out front, and so that parking helps the town and the businesses in the town. When we put that on, I don't care which end of town it goes on, but it needs to be integrated into businesses.
So that's, yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll probably have to really look at our,
Well, to me, if they want to do it, you can put two, and business can be on the west and east, and that's where the two go.
Right.
Yeah. You could, it can be viewed quite synergistically if you want to. We talked about that word in some of our breakouts. So, but I think that's good discussion. We got to get a little deeper into it.
One element specifically about this, I know that was addressed a couple of times, was those landscape medians and how we dislike those so much. And we add that in so it's not, so it's discouraged, not encouraged.
So, yeah, so we, it's an interface with UDOT, but we thought we would put together, we've been involved in a number of downtown revitalization projects that are actually sort of the next step from general planning processes. It's really the some real implementation, concrete and asphalt and that kind of stuff. We wanted to show you some views of that kind of stuff, so we could start shepherding our view of what we want the highway to look like through our town,
Rather than UDOT telling us.
rather than UDOT telling us what they want. Because they will impose the, you can't make a left turn anywhere and all that kind of stuff, because they're about getting from point A to point B. And what we need to be thinking about is, how can we help people maybe even slow down a little bit and enjoy the scenery that's available as they come through town, and maybe even let some pedestrians cross while they're at it. So our notion about that is much more of a neighborhood type view, where we're going to close things in a little bit, and certainly we cannot accommodate a median in that scenario. Is that? And we've got some examples of actually constructed stuff that started in schematic, and that's what we'll share in this programming. We thought some of that turned out really well and did help these communities sort of shepherd the UDOT process.
Yeah, and I know that's kind of we're working with another community on the other side of Zion. So they see that other traffic that goes down 89, and that's part of their issue too, is, it's a small community and they see a lot of traffic going through, and it's same site, same scenario, right? Post office on one side, people can't walk anywhere, they don't feel safe, going across the street or whatever. It's an issue, and I think a lot of the conversation we've had has kind of covered, the integration portion, the goals and things that we have with the shuttle system, like figuring out where the best area of parking need be if it's going to be implemented. Safe, convenient, and efficient systems, whether that be new roads, pedestrian accesses to get across SR9, trails, sidewalks.
Maybe we need to get the state to put in a couple of roundabouts on each end of town. And don't let anybody. No, I didn't say that.
Where's that notorious one in Paris?
Oh,
right?
gosh.
You get it on the inside, you stay there for 12 hours. Right?
What a great plan. Let's make sure that that's in there now.
Just a big one. Yeah.
All right. Anything else on that one?
I think unless anybody else has any more comments with related to the goals, I think it's been.
So, and who's got the circulation? You've got that one too.
Yeah.
Lucky you.
What is it?
Roads and
all that, yeah.
Roads.
I think you walked out at that point and.
I didn't remember that. Do not leave the meeting early. So economic, do you want to touch on that really quickly? And then infrastructure, we're not going to fully get to, but it's a completely unique element. And we can dive into that. You've got that one, Ellen, as well. And we'll dive into that. But suffice it to say, we're into the weeds on that one with sewer, water, storm drain, all of that stuff.
Okay, so at the current time, the town's financial status is fairly stable. Virgin Town does not have a thriving economic element / economy. Tourist and employment opportunities are limited, yet Virgin Town has the benefit of being located in a high tourist area with some of the most beautiful and spectacular scenery. The town needs to use this location to its advantage. Before anything can be done in this arena, Virgin Town will first need to integrate adequate infrastructure to support growth and manage development. So the desires from the public open houses and comments, there is a need for some type of village town center. We talked about that, and increased opportunities for employment. This new zone should be the backbone to growing the economic element of Virgin. The town needs to take advantage of its location and grow. Within this village town center would be an information center and signs welcoming visitors and informing them as to what is available. And for the goal benefiting from the current traffic pattern. I mean, you can't do anything about it, the traffic's coming through, right, on SR9 there, so we might as well use it to our advantage here. Promote commercial development down the main corridor, as we've talked about. Develop the needed infrastructure, target tourist businesses, consider a tourist information center and additional signage. Of course, all signages will be in balance with the viewscapings that we talked about. Welcome visitors to town of Virgin, encourage new families to move to Virgin, again with the affordable housing and options, along with securing the sustainability of long-term residents.
It's a lot, and they're not always mutually compatible. We're going to work on that, but that captures sort of our thoughts based on what we heard. Comments related to that? Up in the night? Doing okay? Okay. Yeah.
I've heard some discussion about Mr. Brooks. Have you heard from the Utah Tourism Board? Have you, he heard some pretty good things about him. He'll come to your town and give a spiel on how to, how best to take advantage of advice about your tourism and everything. He went to Springdale before they did that project up there.
They didn't listen to him either.
Obviously, right?
Well, he talked to me and put in 8 or 9 sidewalks. Different things like that that maybe we would think about. So.
Yeah, I've heard of him. It's part of the state, and I think it's through the governor's office, actually.
It's free.
Yeah. So let's make a note of that and maybe say something about this. Yeah, what's that?
Free, is that somebody else's money?
Well, nothing is totally free, right? It's actually a response to some of the criticism from Southern Utah to the governor's office about, it's all fine and good for you guys to advertise the national parks all over the world, but show us a little love, right? And that's been some of the response. That's been part of that. Okay, infrastructure.
Oh, you're gonna go to it?
We've got, 6 minutes, 4 minutes, what is it? Which clock are we looking at? 4 minutes.
4 minutes. It don't matter, either one.
Okay. My thought on infrastructure before we dive in is it kind of pertains to everything else in this document, right? It's going to kind of sustain it or make or break those different elements if it's done correctly or not. And in my mind, infrastructure is everything that town needs to survive. Road systems, sewer, water, we need to, have those amenities that we can provide a great place to live, right? That's what infrastructure provides. And so the infrastructure element is agreeably the most critical because infrastructure development is required to fully support the goals and objectives of all other general plan elements. Although upgrades to water, drainage, roads, and town facilities are necessary to support the general plan, the wastewater system will likely drive the feasibility of the general plan objectives from the other elements. The realization of the general plan objectives, especially commercial and higher density residential development, depends on cost-effective wastewater services. The eventual shift to public wastewater management represents the most significant change in town services likely since the incorporation.
Did you get that one? Because once we go down that road, it's like that technology escalator that we hear about. Once you get on it, you think there's a stop at the second and third floor. There isn't. They purposefully didn't build those stops because they want you to stay on the blasted escalator and keep buying the software as you go along, right? There's no getting off once you get on, and so there's some analogy to that in this regard. So we got to figure it out.
And although not typical in general plan scopes, the infrastructure element in Virgin's general plan includes recommendations for infrastructure upgrades in detail. The town should be aligned on infrastructure development planning and implementation because there will be a whole community benefits and impacts for each citizen that receives higher levels of municipal services. And so from that standpoint, when we include the full infrastructure portion of it, we'll see you know, the cost-effective infrastructure developments from an engineering standpoint. You know, we'll go with the imminent projects that the town sees in the near future, the relative future, to keep what you have now functioning correctly, as well as planning for the future as well. You know, there's tank projects, water line, portions of water lines throughout the community that are maybe a little undersized even right now, that need to be upgraded to support what you have. And so that's, you know, in the desired portion of, we'll see that. And, you know, while, you know, in the cost-effective infrastructure development by, you know, by developers that support all general plan element objectives. And I think we've kind of talked about that.
I think all the new development, we don't have a problem with, because that's gonna be done by the developers.
Right.
Yeah.
But a lot of the old stuff, and there is a lot of old stuff, that is past.
Right.
And we're starting to have huge leaks and stuff now.
So, yeah, and we promised you guys that that's an area that we would really give you some detail on as part of our proposal, and we're gonna make good on that promise. And we have, we didn't bring it with this because we wanted this piece to be consistent with the other pieces, but we have we have probably a 10-page write-up that we will share with you as the element leader, like tomorrow, for your consideration, review, dive into it, and we'll outshare that as soon as you've had a chance to take a first crack at it.
Does that include suggestions on how we can obtain funds to
Yes.
do those improvements?
Yes, and it goes so far as to look at the existing road system right now and make some connections where we've got some dead ends and sort of, that's not really a typical, and we talked about this, it's not a typical general planning scope, but we kind of need that to sort of frame the rest of this. And so we told you we would do some of that. So we're going to connect the dots in the road system a little bit in the context of a transportation system master map. We're going to have that as part of this.
There'll be suggestions on grants that we could apply for?
Oh, sorry, the funding thing as well. Right, so you've already experienced a little of that, and we've got a whole number of other ones we want to put on the table.
And you're also talking about the water needs, because that's going to be real critical for
The what?
Water needs.
Yes.
Fresh water needs.
Yes. Yeah, and in fact, it even goes back to the reuse notion a little bit.
Yeah. So I had a question about the infrastructure element here. When we're talking about a wastewater system for the community, is it feasible and would it be cost effective, or are we just wasting our time to have new developments put in the infrastructure for a sewer and then just have it end at the subdivision so that it's available to hook up in the future? Or is that something that's not feasible because we don't know exactly what we're going to do with that sewer yet?
So, yeah, address that, and then and read the element that the goal element that covers that a little bit.
Yeah, that's
It's the overlay zone.
the commercial corridor. Yeah, so
Second one.
the ordinance, no.
Let's see, which one? No,
Create
it
a
is.
commercial corridor, yeah,
It
so
is.
create a commercial corridor overlay zone to seed the funding of infrastructure development for wastewater public utilities should be established to receive, manage and deploy overlay zone funds. So the question.
Sorry, so what we're trying to capture there is the starting point for eventual deeper infrastructure development. So what we're saying is, in the commercial zone, we're also going to set an overlay that possibly creates a funding mechanism to generate some revenue. We talked about that briefly a couple of meetings ago. We're putting that back on the table. We got mixed reviews about that. We're not impacting the entire town with that. We really want to impact new development, some modest revenue that we can grow into much bigger dollars.
Yeah, I'm not referring to that.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't make myself clear.
Yeah.
What I'm talking about is like new subdivisions. So when we put in when a new housing development comes in, they put in all their own infrastructure. Is it feasible, and do we have a good enough idea of how that sewer system would have to flow, that we can require them to put in the initial infrastructure to each lot? So
Gotcha.
that when that time comes and we are moving the entire city up, we're not digging up another residential street to put another main trunk line and offshoots off to every individual house. Is that something that's feasible, or do we not even know how the sewer is gonna flow enough that?
Do you want to add comment to that before we address it?
Well, my thing is, if you go build a subdivision and they can use a standard septic system tank, they can do that. If they can't, they're gonna have sewer lines going to their.
We're gonna have to cluster or alternative system or something.
Yeah, but you won't have a main out in the street.
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about
Yeah.
eventually 50 years, 40 years, 30 years, I don't care. Eventually they hook up to a municipal sewer. Is it feasible to require them to put that main trunk line in so that that portion of town does not have to be completely ripped up when that day comes?
So my answer, and we've worked on this, and Josh has the lead on this, but my answer is not today. Partly because we need some discussion about this from you, starting with the Planning and Zoning Commission, and specific to this element. What do we want to do? What kinds of things do we want to consider? Once we've narrowed that point of consideration, yeah, we can start telling you what size of pipes would run all the way through town 40 years from now in the eventual system. And make some decisions about, are we going to require new developments to put dry sewer lines in preparation for that eventuality? We absolutely could do that.
Because I think if we understood that, I think requiring those subdivisions to do that would be a minimal cost to them in the initial startup. But
An enormous cost.
But it's an enormous cost when the whole city has to go look up.
Very insightful, and completely agree.
Dig up your own.
I think what Mr. Mayor was referring to, they got all those sewer lines and everything going to their one.
Yeah, you were talking about clusters and stuff like that, right?
And we can require where those things go so that it'd be easy just to hook on to. You know, they would be using those sewer flows.
So it does actually relate to what you're talking about in that sense.
I have big subdivision,
I agree.
40 houses.
I agree, but if they're running their sewer to the north, because they have a house to the south, and they're running all their sewer to a treatment plant in the north, but eventually all that sewer is going to run to the south, then that's what I'm asking. I don't even know that it's feasible or doable. I don't know if we have that information yet, but.
That's one of the things that I brought up earlier on. We had that problem with their sparks. They grew so fast. Subdivisions had their own pipe set up. Some had 8, some had 10, whatever. The city came through, that's exactly what they did. And it was a problem. I mean, communities were tore up. Because they tried to put in new pipes. But having it all, if they put it in the right size piping, then he said having a dry system in place and not using.
Look at the time.
I think the thing to really keep in mind of the infrastructure part of this, our impact fees go for new projects.
Yes.
Somehow we've got to figure out how we're going to pay for all the existing pipes in the town. Grants don't pay them all.
Yeah.
Public service.
We've got to come up with a way that the town services.
You know what? And we do need to provide a little guidelines for that, and we can do that.
Yeah.
Because there's the new development piece, and there's how do you maintain what you already got. are those compatible? Can we figure that out? Very good point. So with that, let's, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
On that sewer system, if, in your studying stuff,
Is this what you're gonna be
if
doing?
in your studying stuff on it,
Or is it something different?
is the, I mean, if